So Damon, we always like to work together, and we've collaborated a lot before in the past, and that's always been so much fun. And so you came with this idea of working on this new project together.
I started thinking about how a lot of the stuff we've done involved either things or places that we both loved. You know, like whenever we did the Salem show, where, you know, that was months in the making, and essentially the entire show, what it was a love letter to Salem. And I started just thinking about how many different ways there were that we could operate on that same sort of premise, like doing what we love doing, but doing it in a way where it shows other people why we love these things.
Love it so much.
And hopefully make them fall in love with it the way we were.
Yeah, kind of the way that we would go around New York City. We would go and experience different places, and we talked about how much we loved this part of the city and how it made us feel, and different parts like that.
Or even like when we were in Salem, like the hotels we were staying at, you know, the coffee shops, things that, you know, are in some ways simple, but are just part of the fabric and like what people call the egregore of the place itself, like the things that make those places special. So we were talking about how we could do that in video form and introduce people to these places and these things that we both loved, whether it's the neighborhoods of New York, whether it's the neighborhoods of New Orleans, or even Salem, but showing people parts of it or letting them know pieces of the history of it that they may not necessarily be familiar with, which is why we decided on the name Invisible Cities. Because we want...
That's a beautiful name. You told me that name, and I literally got goosebumps. You texted it to me while I was in Canada, and I was like, and this is months ago, and I was like, oh my God, that's just such a beautiful and brilliant name, because it's like the core of the hidden things that we love about things that maybe you don't normally think about every day, you know.
And I honestly cannot take the credit for that, because I first heard that title from a book I read when I was in prison. I read a book called Invisible City by a writer named, I believe it was Calvino, C-A-L-V-I-N-O. And it was like a book of poetry, but it was about like places of the city that most people didn't normally see, or making people think of it in a way they wouldn't normally think of. And I thought that's exactly what we're doing, but we want to do it plural because we want to cover like all of these amazing, beautiful places. So Invisible Cities. Yeah.
Beautiful.
And even that, you know, talking about invisible things most people don't get to see. Like right now, what we're overlooking, like this is one of the courtyards, one of the many courtyards in the French Quarter. And the average person that comes here, like say as a tourist and walks down the street, will probably never even know that these places exist. They'll never have access to them. And the reason that they exist is because whenever the French and Spanish lived here, they considered it to be like rude or kind of gross to display your wealth. You know, they weren't like flash and bling or any of that. Like they wanted to have a modest appearance.
Really,
So the way they did that is whenever they built all of the houses, they would build them with their backs to the street and the fronts facing inward. So like this, where we're sitting right now, this is actually where I live, and this is my front door, is around here, not facing the street. Same way the person who lives there, that's his front door. The back of his house is facing the street. So it creates all of these areas that are just like private gardens that most people will never get to see.
For me coming, I mean, I would have never known it unless you told me about this aspect of it, and then obviously I came to your house. But you know, as we toured around the city and you started pointing out, if you look back there, you can kind of see, and it's just, some of them are just mind-blowing.
You get little glimpses.
And
just tiny little glimpses like when you look through the fence. And some of them, you know, like if you looked through the alleyway that you have to come through to get around to the front door, most people would see it and just think, oh, it's a narrow little dark alley. They would have no idea that it opens up onto a courtyard.
Because they do. That's exactly what they look like. Exactly like you just said, a narrow, you know, it looks like just a little place where you would put your trash or something, you know.
Yep. And one of the great things also, like if you notice, most of these trees are like evergreen trees. You know, like palm trees, they never lose their leaves or any of that. So they always provide shelter over this place. So it's almost like not only are you in this garden, but you have a covering over you, protecting you from the sun. Yep.
It's beautiful.
As you can see, our cats love it out here. This is their, they basically live on the terrace 24/7.
Yeah. Well, we really, really hope you love what we put together for this first episode. And
welcome to Invisible Cities.
And this is New Orleans. Going to be headed now, Damien?
We are headed to the corner of Bourbon and St. Phillips to the one of the oldest, if not the absolute oldest bar in the United States. It's called John Lafitte's Blacksmith Bar, and John Lafitte was a really, really famous pirate and part of the deep, rich history of this place. Like, at one point, the governor put out a bounty on John Lafitte's head, saying, you know, there's going to be a reward for whoever kills this guy. John Lafitte responded by putting a bounty on the governor's head. So what happened eventually was during the war, when they were trying to drive the British out of Louisiana, they went to John Lafitte and said, if you will enlist the rest of your ships to help fight our cause, we'll pardon all of your crimes. So it was thanks to the pirate who owned this blacksmith. It used to be a blacksmith before it was a bar.
It's incredible because it still looks like it's from back in the day, and nothing's changed.
Yep,
it's unbelievable.
If you look up old pictures of this place, it looks pretty much always exactly like it did. Now you can even see inside the fireplace is where the anvil used to be, where they would hammer out tools, weapons, all of that still in there. It's also said to be haunted. Who knows?
All right, let's go check it out.
Yeah. Get an early morning drink.
Yeah. Wow. Beautiful. I mean, I'm sure over the years they must have tried to remodel some of this.
Probably,
but
yeah.
I love how they kept the original style, you know, of the whole place.
Yes.
It's unbelievable.
Diet Coke.
A Diet Coke?
Yeah.
And I'll have an IPA, please.
You should get a Hurricane.
What's a Hurricane?
That's like the local drink.
Is it really? But it's like a mixed drink,
yeah,
right?
Yeah. They call it the purple drink.
The purple drink? Thank you. Cheers to Lafitte's. Excellent. All right, let's go.
So now we're headed down to the Vampire Cafe, which is on Royal Street, the corner, I believe, of Royal and St. Anne, if I'm not mistaken. And the reason they call it the Vampire Cafe, there's like a really rich history in New Orleans of things associated with vampirism too, like real life stories. One of those stories is at this location, at what's now the Vampire Cafe. Back in, I believe it's the 1800s, but you might want to look that up for yourself and make sure. It could have been 1700s. But one day, a woman is running down the street, bloody and screaming. The police stop her and ask her what's going on. She says that two brothers, John and Wayne Carter, had been holding her hostage upstairs at what's now the Vampire Cafe, and that they had been coming every night to drink her blood. She said that she was not the only one, that they also had several other people up there that they had tied to chairs and would come every night, reopen their wrist, and start drinking their blood again. Police think she's crazy until they come up here and look, and sure enough, they find people in the room tied to chairs. Their wrists had been cut several times. There were also dead bodies rolled up in carpets in the back. So the police just stayed there and waited for the brothers to arrive that night. As soon as they arrived, saw the police, they immediately confessed to what they had done, said that they couldn't help themselves, that they were vampires.
And they never do it again.
They also asked to be executed because they say they're not going to be able to stop doing it. So they obliged them, and they were eventually executed. Actually, at the park right down the street from here, Armstrong Park, there is a tree there that people still leave offerings, and a lot of the local voodoo practitioners still do ceremonies around it on Sunday, but that's where they ended up being hanged at. And today it's the Vampire Cafe. So you can see this is the menu for the Vampire Cafe, and there's little illustrations on it that show like the history of the place. Like there's the Carter brothers. You can see people bound to chairs in the background. One of them's holding a straight razor while the other one's drinking blood. There's the woman running down the street that escaped. That was the clue to, you know, busting the whole thing open, letting the world know about it. Here, this is an illustration from another famous historic vampire legend about the Count Saint Germain, who lived in a house a few blocks down, but it was kind of the same thing. One day a woman jumped off the second floor trying to escape from him. The cops tell her that this guy tried to drink her blood. The police go to him. He's a really wealthy, noble aristocrat, has a lot of respect in the community. So the cops, instead of arresting him, say, would you just come down to the police station and talk to us tomorrow about this? He says, sure, I'll do that. When they go back and look the next morning, he had packed up all of his stuff and left in the middle of the night and was never seen again. These right here are, it says the Casket Girls here, but technically they were called the Casket Girls. When people hear that word, they think it means like a coffin. Technically, casket was just like a wooden box of some sort, but those were women that at one point, there were way more men here, like in the early days of Louisiana and New Orleans, there were way more men than there were women, so they were trying to get more women to come over here. And most of the women who would come over here were going to be people that were trying to escape something from their past or did not, you know, live miserable lives wherever they came from. And a lot of them would actually die in the journey over here. And they said that if they died, they would put them in the boxes that they were carrying their belongings in, which is how they got the name the Casket Girls. So 3 vampire stories of New Orleans: the Casket Girls, the Carter brothers, and the Count Saint Germain. If you want to know more about the vampire legends of New Orleans, start with those. So if you're really interested in vampires, especially how they tie into New Orleans, not only is there the Vampire Cafe and all of the old vampire history, but there's also the Boutique du Vampire right behind the Vampire Cafe, where you can get custom-made fangs. Yeah, really nice ones. You can get books about the vampire histories of New Orleans, t-shirts, the usual tourist stuff. As well as things that are a little more rare, handmade, stuff like that by, you know, more local artists, right behind the Vampire Cafe.
And this is where they tie it all up?
Yep.
In a beautiful bow. So there are actually not a lot of chain businesses in the French Quarter. They try to keep everything
you know, as traditional New Orleans as they can. One of the exceptions, things that people need are like drugstores. So what we're standing in front of right now is a Walgreens, but it wasn't always a Walgreens. At one time it was a bank. And this is actually the birthplace of, you know, most people nowadays have heard of the South as being called Dixie or Dixieland. That started here because once upon a time this was a bank, and this was when the French still ruled this place. This bank decided they were going to start printing their own money, and one of the first things they printed was a $10 bill. Well, in French, well, I'm just going to read the plaque to you so that you get it straight from the horse's mouth. The birthplace of Dixie. On this site from 1835 to 1924 stood the Citizen State Bank, originator of the Dixie. In its early days, the bank issued its own $10 banknote with the French word Dix for 10 printed on the note's face. As this currency became widespread, people referred to its place of origin as the land of the Dix, which was eventually shortened to Dixieland. Through song and legend, the word became synonymous with America's Southland. And now it's a Walgreens.
I can wait for the water.
Royal is my favorite street in the French Quarter. It is the street where you're going to find, you know, the most art museums, really the most culture. You know, when people think of New Orleans, they usually think of like people going on drunken binges, which is what happens a lot on Bourbon Street. But it's also a place of a lot of culture and music and art, and the heart of that part of New Orleans is Royal Street. So if you're looking at this building right here with all the iron railing, like even though this is the French Quarter, most of the architecture here is actually Spanish influenced. All the ones with the iron railing, that's what those are. And part of the reason for that is because at one point during the 1800s, almost the entire French Quarter burned down. And when it was rebuilt under Spanish rule, so most of the architecture was done by the Spanish. This is one of the very few remaining actual examples of French architecture. And you might recognize this place from the original Interview with the Vampire movie. There's a scene where Lestat and Louis feed on an entire family. And in the movie, you see them having a funeral procession where they're carrying the family's coffins out. This is the building from that scene, and it's being restored right now. So this corner right here, this is what I was talking about when I said, okay, you gotta smell it. This is Crawdads and Mildew Corner. See what I mean?
Yeah. Oh my God, that smells good.
Crawdads and corn on the cobs.
But when a flood waters from Hurricane Katrina stuck around for you all, it's off in the foundation, that building comes.
Today we're standing in front of the Joan of Arc statue.
Yes.
And she seems to be a big, which I never knew about, but she seems to be like a really big saint here of New Orleans.
One of the patron saints of New Orleans. So a lot of the cities in the U.S. when they were founded were named after European cities, especially if they were connected in some way to the people that settled there, you know, like New York, you know, being named after York. Mm-hmm. Same way with New Orleans. It was named after Orleans, the city in France, of which Joan of Arc is the patron saint of Orleans. So this statue was actually given to New Orleans as a gift from the people in Orleans in France, because they're like sister cities. But she is one of the patron saints that overlooks everything here. And you can see also when you get up inside, there's like different coats of arms from other, you know, cities in France or family bloodlines associated with it also.
It's absolutely beautiful. And as you notice, you see her much more throughout the city as you walk around.
Yeah, not just here, but also like in the church. There's another statue of her in St. Louis Cathedral.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I find fascinating and amazing about the story of Joan of Arc is you see right here, she was born in 1412, died in 1431. That means she was only 19 years old whenever she died. So this is a teenager leading troops into battle. To me, that makes the story 100 times more amazing than if we were talking about somebody who is 30 or 40 years old. So you see like just a little history about when this place was erected, the statue, but it says the mayor at the time was a guy named Moon Landreau or Landreau. This is also why they call like the area over in front of the Mississippi River, the River Walk, it's also called the Moon Walk. And that's why they call it the Moon Walk. It's named after the guy who was the mayor at the time, whose name was really Moon.
We're standing behind this building here. We walked by this the other day and you were talking a little bit about it. But
it's actually a really famous restaurant. It's like traditional New Orleans food, you know, a lot of crawfish, etouffee, gumbo, that sort of thing. But they always talk about this place when they do like haunted tours of New Orleans, stuff like that. And one of the reasons is because the guy who originally owned this place, like he loved this place. It was his life. But he ended up losing it in a poker game. Like he didn't have enough money to cover his bet, so he bet his own building. He lost the game, was gonna lose this place. Instead of just vacating, giving it up, he actually went upstairs and killed himself. And to this day, they
way to stay in the building, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. Well, he kind of, and that's exactly what happened, because to this day, they say that he still haunts this place. And if you eat here, you can go up to what they call the seance room, where the people who own it now have set a table like dedicated to him, where they still like prepare meals for him because they say he's still here in the building. He never left it.
And that's up top.
Yeah.
One chronic gambler.
One thing you'll notice about the French Quarter is a lot, almost all of the streets are named after various saints. Not all of them. Some of them are tied into, you know, this royal bloodline, which is why, you know, there's a street called Royal and there's a street called Bourbon. The Bourbon family was another, you know, branch of this bloodline. But like, for example, this street that we're on, where Muriel's is St. Anne, and St. Anne was the grandmother of Christ and the mother of Mary. So you've got, like, anywhere you go here, you've got, you know, St. Anne, St. Philip, St. Peter. Pretty much all of these streets are going to be connected to Catholicism in one way or another. So you'll notice these all over the place. They're just like plaques telling you what the names of the streets were under either the French rule or the Spanish rule, you know, just trying to keep history alive. So from 1762 to 1803, still well before the Civil War, this street was called Santa Anna. Still to this day, it's called St. Anne, which is the English translation of this. But you'll see these all over the French Quarter.
So this is such a beautiful city, but what brought you here? What was the calling?
I always think of this quote by the writer Tennessee Williams. He said, "There's only 3 cities in the United States: New York, New Orleans, and San Francisco." He said everything else is Cleveland. And those are the 3 cities in the U.S. that when you're in those cities, you know you're in those cities. Like when you see, you know, I've never, you know, like resonated that much with California, but when you're in San Francisco, like, you know, when you look around, oh, this is San Francisco.
San Francisco.
You know, you have things there that you don't have anywhere else, like the trolley system, the Golden Gate Bridge, all of that sort of thing. Same way in New York. You know, when you see that skyline in New York, you know you're looking at New York.
New York, yeah, there's no doubt.
Yeah, you're not going to confuse it with any other place. Same way, if you brought somebody here blindfolded in the dead of night, had them on the streets of the French Quarter and pulled the blindfold off and said, "Where are you at?" They're going to know I'm in New Orleans.
New Orleans,
You know, it's
yeah.
instantly recognizable
Yeah.
because of the feel, the energy. So that was part of it. It's just, you know, one of the cities in the United States that is incredibly distinct, has like its own individual personality, flavor, culture, history, like a very rich one. So that was part of it. But the other part for me personally is just the connection to like really old school ceremonial magic that runs through this place. You know, some of these stories, there's absolutely no way to prove this whatsoever, but some of the things that were like believed throughout history, for example, is that the French royalty, the bloodline of the French royal families, traces its origin all the way back to Christ and Mary Magdalene. You know, they say that when Christ was crucified, only 2 people stayed with him. All the men ran off thinking they're going to be next. The only 2 people who stayed with him were Mary, his mother, and Mary Magdalene, who some people believe was his wife. You know, like when you're reading the Bible, it talks about how the first miracle that Jesus does is to turn water into wine at a wedding, but it never tells you whose wedding it was. A lot of people, especially in like Gnostic sects of Christianity, believe that it was his and Mary Magdalene's wedding.
Yeah, Jesus and Mary Magdalene.
So the story is that after he's crucified, the disciples bring Mary Magdalene by ship over to the mountains of France. And a lot of this might sound kind of crazy, but if you start looking into, like, all you would have to look up on the internet is Mary Magdalene Reliquary Cathedral, France, and you come up with this beautiful church in the mountains of France where they actually have what they say is her skeleton preserved. Like, you can see her skull in a golden reliquary, kind of like the ones that were at the cloisters.
Yep.
So they say that she was pregnant with the child of Christ whenever she escapes to France, and that it was the French royal bloodline that descended from their child. And you trace this through, like the first, like the really important bloodline was called the Merovingians, and they were like these really, really famous and influential family, including the king, who did all sorts of cultural stuff and everything else. But this is where they got the name. In one of the Matrix sequels, there's even a character called the Merovingian, and that's who they named it after. So the Merovingian bloodline gives way to the Carolingian bloodline. Carolingians were like later, you know, branches of the family. The Carolingian bloodline gives way to a third bloodline, and I cannot remember what the name of it is right now off the top of my head, but it's another one of those names like Merovingian, Carolingian. King Louis was a member of that bloodline. So the saint that this cathedral is named after was seen as being a member of the bloodline of Christ, in addition to all the other stuff he did about feeding the poor, changing the judicial system, all of that kind of stuff. He was seen to be, I mean, just to say it like for what it is, related to Jesus. And that was one of the reasons I chose this place. You know, this is one of my favorite places in all of New Orleans.
Yeah. You have that connection. You feel that draw, you know.
And you've seen the cathedrals in New York, like how beautiful they are, like St. Patrick's and all that.
Yeah.
I honestly believe that the cathedrals in New Orleans are more beautiful than even any of the ones that I've seen in New York. And this is, honestly, I would say there's some that are even more beautiful than this one.
Than the one we're going to go
But
with.
this is the most famous one. And I always, you know, for me, like that's somebody told me one time, like if you're going to take on the characteristics and qualities of the people that you spend the most time with and the places where you spend the most time. And whenever I heard that, it was like something clicked in me. Yeah, it made me realize, well then it made me think about what qualities do I want? What characteristics do I want? What do I want to surround myself?
I want to fill this with,
Yes, so that's why I would start going, and I started even when we were in New York, like going to cathedrals sometimes and spending all day long in these churches. And you can do the same thing here, you know, pretty much every day if they hold Mass here every day. That's the other thing. I believe it's the oldest continually operating cathedral in the United States. But you can still go to Mass here every day.
Every day.
And you hear the clock the bells chime out every
right,
hour.
Yeah, yeah. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. They just chimed right before Mass started.
Yeah.
Because it's a little after noon now, and Mass today is at noon.
Yep.
This is the church, and this is the first church of...
This is St. Louis Cathedral. It's named after the King of France at the time. He was the king in the early 1200s. I can't remember exactly what the years were, but this is named after him. He was one of the people also, and we're going to go over there and get a closer look at it. They've got stained glass windows inside that kind of tell his story. But some of the things that he was known for, one of the reasons he was canonized, made a saint, is because he was responsible in France for changing the legal system so that you were innocent until proven guilty. Like before he took over, before he changed everything, if you got charged or accused of something, you were automatically considered guilty and you had to prove you were innocent in a court of law. He reversed that, changed that. Other things he was famous for is when he was king on normal everyday days, he would bring at least 100 poor people into the castle a day and make sure that they were fed. Sometimes he would even serve them himself. So he was known for like his kindness to people who were poor, as well as changing the judicial system. Another thing about this church is if you look at it from this angle, you see it looks a lot like the castle on the when you see anything made by Walt Disney, the Disney Corporation, you always see the Disney castle.
Yes.
This is where he got
you can
that
totally
design
see it.
or was influenced by that design.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially the steeples, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. You see right in front of it, there's a statue in the middle of the park. This park is called Jackson Square. The statue in the middle of it is of Andrew Jackson, who was the 9th president of the United States. Right next to it, the building on facing this way, the left-hand side right there, it's called the Cabildo. That is where Louisiana became part of the United States. Like at the time of the Louisiana Purchase, when the United States bought basically the entire middle part of the country, including Louisiana, Arkansas, a lot of other states, that's where the deal was made, where they signed the Louisiana Purchase and bought pretty much the entire middle part of the country for $14 million. It happened in that building right there.
$14 million.
For the whole middle part of the country.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah. Now it's hard, buying property for that price in some places.
And I suppose Andrew Jackson wasn't too bad of a guy, seeing how he's still standing.
I am going to be honest with you. I know almost nothing about Andrew Jackson whatsoever, other than that that's his statue. I know that the man who adopted me, Jack Eccles, that's who he was named after.
Oh, really?
Yeah, his name was Andy Jack, and his parents had named him after Andrew Jackson.
Holy shit, I never knew that.
So I don't know anything about him at all, other than that's his statue, that he shared the name with my adopted dad.
Wow.
Yeah.
Crazy. So we're going to go inside.
Yes. We are in St. Louis Cathedral here in the heart of the French Quarter. This is the very heart of the French Quarter, what we're looking at right now. Everything was meant to emanate out from the church. And what we came here for is to look at the stained glass windows, which tell the story of the king's life all the way up until his death, him being canonized a saint. So these are actually some of my absolute favorite stained glass windows of any cathedral or church or any other place in this entire country. One is just because of how intricate and lifelike they are, but the other one is just because of the stories they tell. All of these stained glass windows all the way around the church are telling the story of King Louis, also Louis the Saint, he's sometimes known as. And you see also the fleur-de-lis on his robe, on his outfit. Fleur-de-lis always represent divinity, royalty, and the bloodline of Christ. Another thing you'll notice in all of these stained glass windows is you'll know, like, kind of to mark this bloodline, that's what you see the halo. Anyone with the halo, the only person in this that has a halo around their head is the king. That's showing that he is the only one out of all of these people who is a descendant of this bloodline that traces its way all the way back to the child of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And this one's just kind of portraying how even when he was a child, you see the books, the Bible under it, like he was always studious, always wanting to study the Word of God, all of that. That's what it's portraying. From a very early age, he felt a calling to that. He's seen as like the epitome of the Christian monarch. Again, with this one, you'll see he's being crowned by the Pope. The Pope doesn't even have that aura, the halo around him, only the king. That's the way you know they always mark members of this bloodline. So this one is actually showing him at his marriage. He's getting married. Once again, you notice he is the only person, not the priest, not his wife, not any of the onlookers. He is the only one who has the halo around his head. Again, you see the fleur-de-lis everywhere, it being the symbol of New Orleans. Some of them are kind of hard to find just because they're under the plant, but they're also all over his robe. And you see them on the banner in the background. He did have some notable, less than favorable aspects about him. Even though he did all of these amazing things like, you know, completely change the justice system so that you were innocent until proven guilty, he also put an end to what they called trial by ordeal. What that means is, like, for example, if you've heard stories of the witch trials, how they would say, you know, if they throw someone in the water and they sink and drown, then they're innocent. But if they float, then they're a witch and they should be burned at the stake or hanged. He put an end to all of that also. But he also led, during the Crusades, he led like invasions and wars against Muslims. So he participated in that. And you can also see, like in a lot of these stained glass windows, this one shows the soldiers, but you'll see the red cross that's also associated with the Knights Templar, which is deeply tied into the history of magic as well. You see that in a lot of these windows. This is, once again, you just see the king is the only one with the halo around his head, but you see as you go through the windows, like they start off in very early youth, they follow his life story all the way around, and eventually we'll get to it portraying his death also. But one of the things that I find interesting, like, you know how if you grew up Catholic, like chances are at some time or another you've done what they call the Stations of the Cross, where you're supposed to walk around the room and you meditate on these images of Christ's life, you know, all the way from his birth to the next one showing carrying the cross, getting ready to be crucified and dying. But one of the things you'll notice as we go down even more is they tie the story of the king together with the story of Christ, and the windows start to mirror the Stations of the Cross. So in this one, for example, this particular Station of the Cross, you see Christ, even on his way to be crucified, is still ministering and talking to people on his way. Like the woman kneeling down, the child in a prayerful pose. He's still, even as he's getting ready to die, trying to tend to people who are less fortunate than he is. And you see that mirrored in the window showing the king ministering to sick people. You can see that showing like it's someone with the plague. They've got sores all over them. You see the people in the background covering their faces with cloths because they don't want to breathe it in. Again, you see the red Maltese cross associated with the Knights Templar as well as other magical orders. So this one, you see the scene from the Bible where everyone is, they call it casting lots to see who is going to take Jesus's garments whenever he's killed. So he's getting ready to die in this one. He's a few moments away from death. You see that mirrored in the window of the king. The king is on his deathbed being given last rites. So they're starting to tie together the death of Christ, or the ministry of Christ, and the good works of the king, along with the death of Christ and the death of the king. Here we're stuck in between for the stations of the cross. Christ is crucified here. He's either dead or dying. Here he is dead and they're removing him from the cross. So both of these are scenes of the death of Christ, and you have sandwiched right between them the funeral procession of the king. And again, you see the red cross, the Templar cross, over his coffin. And this one just shows him being made a saint or being canonized by the Pope. The guy right here with the three-tiered hat is the Pope, and you see a statue, a small statue of the king covered in fleur-de-lis. So what we're looking at right now is the actual Bible that belonged to the king, to St. Louis. It says the Bible of St. Louis belonged to St. Louis IX, King of France, who gave it to Alfonso X, the Wise. It was copied and illustrated between 1226 and 1234 in Paris. Life in the Middle Ages is revealed through the images presented in this codex. Biblical texts and glosses blend with the iconography to create an unalterable whole. It's a unique monument, a book illumination that constitutes both unlimited information for historians and a boundless source of pleasure to the senses. So basically they're saying this was the King's Bible, that it's meant to convey information not only about the Bible, but you can look at the iconography, you can look at the imagery and discover a lot about what life was like during the time when he was alive, as well as it just being absolutely beautiful and a work of art unto itself. So we are at a shop called Starling Books and Crafts. In New Orleans, especially in the French Quarter, there's a lot of witchcraft shops, there's a lot of voodoo shops. They vary as far as whether it's going to be like a tourist trap or a real authentic place, because you have both. You know, you have families that have practiced voodoo for generations that do have authentic shops here where you can get supplies. But you also have a lot of places that are just like, you know, tourist traps. This is the only place that caters to hardcore ceremonial magic. Everything here, like it's a very small place, but the books are all like first editions, really nice. They make all their own essential oils, things like that. But the thing that's amazing about this place is that when Crowley lived in New Orleans, one of the places that he stayed was behind here. This was his home for a short period of time. While he was living here, he also used to regularly drink at the old Absinthe House and even wrote a poem about it. So now we are going to check out the Absinthe House. So this was actually Crowley's favorite city in the United States, New Orleans. He loved this place. He hated New York, loved New Orleans, but he used to come here to this absinthe bar every single day and drink the days away. And he even, there's a journal entry that reads very much like poetry about this place and his time here. He says, "Keep always this dim corner for me, that I may sit while the green hour glides, a proud pavine of time. For I am no longer in the city accursed, where time is horsed on the white gelding death, his spurs rusted with blood. There is a corner of the United States which he has overlooked. It lies in New Orleans."
Shall we go inside?
Let's do it. So this little thing on the counter here, that's a absinthe fountain. I'm not sure how old it is. It's at least a couple of 100 years old. So that was here when Crowley was here. Wow. Should we go in and get one?
Sounds, yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Cheers, everybody. Where are we again, Damien?
New Orleans. To New Orleans.
New Orleans.
Together, she's the one I'm missing. So we never lay together. She's the one I'm missing. So I went back down to St. James Infirmary. I seen my baby there. She was stretched out on a long white table. So cold, so sweet, so fair. Oh, let her go, let her go. God bless her soul, wherever she may be. She could look this whole wide world over, but she'll never find a straight man like me.
So we are at the New Orleans Pharmacy Museum. It's basically a historical museum that traces like the evolution of medicine, especially here in the city. But you see like the jester with his open mouth, they call it a gaper. It says gapers such as this wooden figurehead were displayed outside pharmacies starting in the late 16th century in the Netherlands. Always presented with an open mouth or with tongue sticking out, the gaper represented the taking of medicine and soon became a recognized symbol of the drugstore intended to lure customers in. And to this day, that's pretty much how the pharmaceutical companies still see you, as just an open mouth to throw more medicine in. But another thing you'll see are the vials filled with red water. Like back in the day, what those are, if you were to walk past here and you were to see these vials filled with red water, it was alerting you to the fact that there was a plague happening and that you should take precaution. So it's like a danger sign, essentially. So this is a plaque talking about, the original use of this place and who was here. And it says, in his shop on this site Louis J. Dufillo practiced pharmacy as one of the first of his profession to have been licensed in the United States. And that happened no later than 1816. Keep in mind the Civil War was 1861 to 1865. So this guy was practicing medicine here decades before the Civil War. That's how long this place goes back. But pharmacist Dufillo symbolizes the beginning of a system of certifying the professional competence of pharmacists and the recognition of the vital significance of that competence for the public health. So this was like the beginning of like having certified medical practitioners. Before that, it was just like the Wild West. You didn't know who you were going to, how professional they were, how much training, how much knowledge, how much education. Like you wouldn't know any of that. You were pretty much taking your chances. This was the beginning of having a certified system so that people would have more faith in it.
That's kind of like back when you would have like the snake oil, you know, salesman.
Exactly.
And, you know,
exactly.
Just making and mixing up remedies and
that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Like buying stuff from a traveling circus or carnival.
Yeah, this is going to cure
and
your.
Even speaking of snake oil, you can even see like the
Yes.
snake, which would eventually become, and it's on the window too. The snake in the shower.
Because now we have the the snake
caduceus,
around the
post.
cross,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, enjoy it.
Now, have you been in here yet?
No, I've always meant to and have just never come in. You can see things too, like from back in the day whenever they used to still use leeches on people and they thought they could draw like illnesses out with leeches. Like there's a leech jar and a diagram of the leech. So what you are looking at directly across the street is what people call the Lalaurie Mansion. And it's famous for two reasons. One of which is that for a while it was owned by Nicolas Cage, who also has a tomb here in one of the cemeteries, which we'll get to later. But the second reason this is famous, it was owned by a woman whose last name was Lalaurie, and this is considered to be one of the most haunted houses in probably the entire United States. And one of the reasons it got that reputation is because back in the days when slavery still existed in New Orleans, Madame Lalaurie and her husband were said to be sadists, meaning they got off on inflicting pain on their slaves. It was found out whenever the building caught on fire and several of the slaves perished because they were restrained and could not leave. There was a huge uproar, outcry about it. She and her husband both packed up, left, went back to France before they could be tried or punished for it in any way. So essentially they got away with it. If you look up in the corner windows, you'll see that they're bricked off. That was said to be the room where they actually carried out their torture, and they bricked it off so that nothing could get in and nothing could get out. It's an unused room now. Front right now of the path that runs along the Mississippi River. And one other thing about this path, like a lot of people will hear sometimes that New Orleans is called the Crescent City. Like that's one of its nicknames. You even see a crescent shape on the police cars. The reason they call it the Crescent City is because if you were above right now looking down at the Mississippi River, you would see that this particular part flows in a crescent shape, like a bow, and New Orleans is built around it. So that's why they call it the Crescent City. But this little path, people are here every day walking, biking, just hanging out, enjoying themselves. The technical name for this path is the Moonwalk, and it was named after a guy who was the mayor here at one point, Moon Landreau, in recognition of his leadership and vision, and he did all kinds of stuff. You see, he was part of the Louisiana State Legislature, he was a councilman, he was the mayor, he was a secretary of the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. He was also a judge on the First Circuit Court of Appeal. So for most of the city's history, the riverfront and the Vicarie, and Vicarie is just another name for French Quarter. Like you'll see all of the signs, most of them don't say French Quarter, most of them will say, like, for example, take this exit to the Vicarie. So anytime you see that, it's just talking about the French Quarter. It says, for most of the city's history, the riverfront and the Vicarie was dedicated to commerce and industry. In 1976, under the Landreau administration, the Moonwalk was constructed, replacing a cargo wharf and shed that occupied this site. It represented the first steps in the city's effort to reclaim the riverfront and the enjoyment of all its citizens and visitors. So up until they started erecting this, this wasn't really used. There was a shed here, a wharf, and it wasn't a place that was like a tourist destination or anything else. They turned it into essentially a long park that follows the path of the river.
So we're at the Armstrong entrance.
Yep, the entrance to Armstrong Park on North Rampart Street. And one of the most amazing things about this place that I love, that I always find fascinating, is that you can come here on Sundays and you can see people still practicing voodoo ceremonies, having rituals out here. You know, not in like a caricature, cartoonish way, but people who their families have practiced these traditions and passed them down for generations, you know, like the real deal. Like they take this very seriously. They're very devoted, dedicated to it. But it started back all the way in the days of slavery. Whenever the white people would go to the Catholic Church, the slaves would come over here and hold their ceremonies. And not only was it like their religious ceremonies, but also, since a lot of these people belonged to different families, this was their chance for the families to all come back together every week and like kind of have a family reunion.
Yeah, celebrate
exactly.
and you know,
exactly.
through their practice and they would do it within the park.
Yeah, yep. Congo Square is actually what they call the particular part of the park where they did it and where they still do it.
And that was probably even before it was considered a park.
Exactly, yes, exactly. There's a lot of other stuff here still. Like one of my favorite things, whenever we first moved here, there's a tree in here that's hundreds of years old. And the people who practice these ceremonies also still go and leave offerings around that tree. Like a lot of times when you go there, you'll find bottles of rum, bouquets of flowers, bags of oranges, other kinds of fruit, coins stuck all in the bark of the tree, all in here. And I've done it myself. Like I brought like, you know, ashes from, you know, burning incense on my own shrine at home. I'll bring those here sometimes and pour them around the base of the tree. Just the tree is seen as kind of like the embodiment of the spirit of New Orleans. Like it's connected to the egregore of the city.
Now would this be the same tree that they hung the boys from?
Exactly. Talking about the Vampire Cafe a while ago, the brothers that, the Carter brothers, when they hanged them, they were hanged from this same tree, which honestly to me seems a little sacrilegious, you know, to use something that people considered sacred to carry out an execution.
Was execution device.
Exactly, yeah, but that is what happened.
That's it, yeah. Well, let's take a walk in.
Yeah.
This is beautiful.
Especially when it's lit up. So this monument was actually erected to honor the slaves who used to meet here at Congo Square. It's called Congo Square. And the plaque at the bottom of it says, during the late 17th century and well into the 18th century, slaves gathered at Congo Square on Sundays and sang, danced, and drummed in authentic West African style. This rich legacy of African celebration is the foundation of New Orleans' unique musical traditions, including jazz. So it's kind of like you've got two very rich, very old mystical traditions that came together here. One, the West African slave traditions, their old religion and you know the legacy that they brought. The other one is the European tradition that the French aristocracy brought over and how they trace their bloodline all the way back to supposedly the child of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. You've got those two rich traditions coming together into this place, which is what made it what it is. And you can see coins around the bottom of it too, where people still leave those as offerings. You can see like all the stuff around the bottom of it, the offerings and whatnot. You see like that little bottle right there?
Yes.
That's stuff I was talking about, Florida water.
Oh,
we
okay.
actually mop our floors with that sometimes. It reminds me, like it smells really, really clean, but it reminds me of the smell in barber shops.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Really? Like kind of maybe like that aftershave type
That's
of thing?
yeah, exactly. But I come out here, like I said, probably twice a week, and I leave stuff out here all the time. You see the coins, see them stuck in the bark.
In the bark of the tree.
Yeah. So what we are standing in front of right now, this tree is considered very sacred to a lot of people who practice the voodoo traditions, as well as people who don't. You know, like I said, I myself have come here and left offerings like to the spirit of the city, but if you look around the base of the tree, you'll see like bottles of Florida water, which is what a lot of people here use to clean their homes. Florida means flower, so it's like flower water. It has a really great scent to it. But they also leave coins stuck in the bark of the tree. You'll see fruit left around it, sometimes bottles of rum. It's usually, but not always, people who are connected to voodoo in some way or another who leave things here. But, you know, for me, I kind of consider it sacred just because of that belief and love and dedication and everything else that people have, you know, directed to this tree over time. I consider it to be special even if you're not part of those traditions. You'll see a lot of people whenever they come up to it even take their shoes off too, as a sign of not only respect to the spirit of the tree and to the spirit of New Orleans, but also just to be in touch with the earth itself around the tree, to hopefully kind of absorb some of the energy of it. We are standing in right now what they call Congo Square, which is the spot where you can see all the brickwork on the ground. This is the spot where they would traditionally have all of the voodoo ceremonies, and they've even erected a sign over there that tells a little bit of the history about the place. Congo Square is in the vicinity of a spot which Yumas Indians used before the arrival of the French for celebrating their annual corn harvest and was considered sacred ground. The gathering of enslaved African vendors in Congo Square originated as early as the late 1740s during Louisiana's French colonial period and continued during the Spanish colonial era as one of the city's public markets. By 1803, Congo Square had become famous for the gatherings of enslaved Africans who drummed, danced, sang, and traded on Sunday afternoons. By 1819, these gatherings numbered as many as 500 to 600 people. Among the most famous dances were the Bambula, the Kalinda, and the Congo. These African cultural expressions gradually developed into Mardi Gras Indian traditions, the second line, and eventually New Orleans jazz and rhythm and blues. And that's one of the things too, like the Indian traditions around here, those are absolutely amazing. You see these guys come through, like especially around Mardi Gras, they're wearing these giant suits that are just covered in all these different colored feathers, and they've got beads hand stitched, like all of these different designs and pictures and almost like murals that they spend all year long stitching these things together by hand. Like they take a lot of pride and put a lot of work into what they're doing. It really is amazing.
Were practices already happening here before they executed?
Yeah, even before there were white people here, before there were slaves here, this area was considered sacred by the Native American tribes that lived in this area. They used to do ceremonies out here before the slaves were even brought over and started. So this place has pretty much always been considered sacred by one group of people or another.
So do you think that like it's almost like I feel that it's like the white people tried to tried to use this as to execute people
It's
as
almost
like
kind of
defacing it and disgracing it,
disrespecting
and disrespecting
it.
exactly disrespecting it.
'Cause, I mean, if you know this is a spot that's always been considered sacred and people are still using it for sacred practices, why would you carry out something like an execution on land like that?
Yeah.
That's exactly.
That's so
what it's
important to so many people, and in such a positive,
Yep.
you know.
And even to this day, even though they did that, you can still see it.
Oh yeah, they
People,
overpowered.
People still consider it a holy place.